is that our election administration is completely politically controlled. West of the Mississippi, generally speaking, although you may have an elected official in charge of election administration, the day-to-day work is done by professionals who are nonpartisan, who are not hired because they're somebody's sister-in-law by marriage, or because they've been a very faithful treasurer to a local Republican club or Democratic club. They're chosen because they have the skills necessary to administer elections, and they are absolutely committed to doing so in an even-handed, nonpartisan, non-political way. Now, if you say to election officials in our state who have grown up in a system that frankly was devised by Tammany Hall and not changed since, they will tell you that it's impossible to have a nonpartisan system. Bourgeois, we have more than half of the country which is able to do it. And in places where they have a boards of elections that is politically appointed, as in North Carolina, the actual employees are nonpartisan professionals, not New York. New York is doing it the good old Tammany Hall 1890s way of allowing the boards of elections to be chosen by the county leaders. And as you in Westchester know, sometimes the county leaders figure they're the most talented people for the job. And the people who are employed by the board are chosen first and foremost, with some exceptions, like the people who are actually in charge of the machines and programming have to have those skills. But most of the positions are patronage systems. And I've actually had a county chair, not Westchester, I won't tell you which county, say to me that reformers misunderstood what the Board of Elections was really about, because one of the very important functions of the Board of Elections, to his mind, was providing employment for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to find jobs, which is really kind of shocking.
Yeah.
But my response to him was, thank you for your honesty.
Yeah.
I know what you're concerned about. It's not what I'm concerned
about. Did you yell bourgeois at him, Susan?
No, I said, thank you for telling me, the truth from your perspective.
Okay.
It's important to know what you're up against, as opposed to having them cover you with lying syrup. Oh, that's great, wonderful, it's too bad we can't do it. No, he was very straightforward. This is patronage, right. We control it because we give people jobs. Now I know what I'm dealing with. I'd rather, frankly, deal with the truth than have dissembling and confusion, and then I don't know what I really need what we really need to accomplish. So this is the other aspect of the system, which is truly unique in my experience in any government entity, is that our county boards of elections are set up deliberately and effectively to be unaccountable to anybody. Just think about that. They are answerable to no one.
Right.
If you want to affect a change in the policy that your county board is following, separate from being able to pass a law telling them to do something different, you have to go to court. You can't go to their supervisor. You can't go to the entity at the county level that they're required to report to, because they don't report accurately. They themselves decide what information they put up. They make public. They play games with the budgets and the budgeting authorities. And they basically will tell you that they do not have to listen to anybody. So how does that manifest itself? In New York City, for instance, the city has something called the Mayor's Management Report, which requires agencies to provide accurate information about how they're spending taxpayer money and to provide basic management information. The Board of Elections does not, because they will tell you they're not a city agency, but they don't provide information to the state either. To the extent that they're required to provide information to the State Board of Elections, sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's accurate, and
Yeah.
sometimes it isn't. So the system is built to make the boards unaccountable and to ensure that they will be political. And that is our big challenge, because the only way we can change this system is through the political system. And as you are so aware in Westchester, when it is the county chairs for the political parties calling the shots, the politicians who could make the changes, either in the legislature, the city council, or the county legislature, are scared to do so.
Yeah.
And therefore they don't. They do not apply any pressure. Then what we see, and we see it, I've lived through it too many elections in New York City, and it's really a problem. What we see are, and I see this at the state level all the time, hearings that are dog and pony shows, where every single person on that committee shows up and rails at the Board of Elections. How dare you? Why don't you? And you've got some staff person sitting there, not a commissioner, a staff person who's been sent to be yelled at,
Right.
not anybody with decision-making power, not anybody who is ultimately responsible. And I have never seen a hearing where the commissioners were required to appear by subpoena, which is the only way to get them.
Susan, so just if you could very briefly tell us here in Westchester, what is the actual charge of the Board of Elections?
The actual charge of the Board of Elections is that they are in charge of the administration of the elections. They have sole responsibility for running elections. Now, their responsibility and basic procedures are outlined in the election law. Some of those procedures make sense. Some of those procedures are antiquated and slow things down. Our election law is based on the attitude that our elections are important to political parties and candidates, and the voter has no role. So it's really the responsibility of the Board of Elections to decide the day-to-day operations of running an election. What technology will be used, what the ballot will look like, how the canvassing, the actual counting of the ballots will take place, where will that be held, how will the public be allowed to see. They make decisions every single day in terms of how our elections will be run. They have the ultimate responsibility. They're charged with following the election law, but within that charge, there is a tremendous amount of discretion, which is given to the boards. And the statute literally says that there is no entity which can challenge the board's hiring and firing decisions.
Okay, so with that charge in mind, Susan, Jarret, tell us what happened last Tuesday and how and why exactly we looked like Georgia in a lot of parts of the county.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So for one thing, I will pick up where Susan started and take a step back and say that what happened last Tuesday is the product of decision-making and maladministration that took place long before last Tuesday. Okay. And one of the challenges that we have with making positive change in this space, with getting the press to cover what's going on in this space, is there's sort of, people don't really think about elections and engage until the run-up to an election. Then it becomes this pressure-cooked, crazy period of time where there's so many problems, so few resources, and very little to get done. And then immediately after an election, the entire world sort of wants to move on. Someone who doesn't win an election is, sour grapes if they raise any question about the outcome. Politicians, they want to start to sort of look forward in the governing. So Suffice to say that we at Vote Early NY, and as part of a proud partner of the Let New York Vote Coalition, we know from our experience that voter protection and voting reform, it can't just be an endeavor that we pick up in the run-up to an election. It has to be something you think about in January when session starts, before the budget is due, and that space after the budget. But on the substance, yes, we are in a pandemic, but many of these are not new 2020 problems. And so, Allison, when you and I spoke, there's 3 stools, at least in June, to the voter access framework, right? There's absentee voting, there's early voting in person, there's primary day. And in this sort of post-op that we're doing now, the question becomes, as you're administering an election, even with the pressure that we're under, how much chipping away took place, either due to misfeasance or malfeasance, of those 3 legs to the stool? And at some point, when does the fairness of the overall election get called into question? Now, you penned a letter, I think it probably issued, I want to say, the Monday after the start of early voting, but you were right on top of that. And I think it was very candid, Allison. You had a Twitter post that sort of said, "I am in shock." And you took a picture of these early voting mailers that had mailed the early voting program that was designated less than 96 hours before early voting began, way out of time, 4 weeks beyond what the statute requires boards to do to announce their plan. And that those mailers, at least 4 localities, were mislabeled. So voters who were assigned to sites in 4 localities in Westchester received a postcard from the board, basically right up against when voting was going to start, directing them to vote early at a site that they were not assigned to. And then it's not really clear, once that was brought to their attention, what proactive action would have been taken immediately after to inform those voters who received that misinformation the accurate information. And there are so many problems, there's so many people on the line that it's hard to dive into each incident, but I will say that just taking those 3 legs of the stool, on the absentee side, we saw a ton of reports of people who were supposed to be mailed, snail mailed an application form that reported never receiving one. These are registered voters, people who are enrolled in the party, holding a primary that should have received them. And then looking at the BOE website, there's just this dramatic disparity. Susan mentioned 62 counties in how the county would then inform the population of voters that you have this new option, right? The governor has taken this action, there's an emergency going on. So, you know, that relief might happen in Albany in a series of executive orders, but then how is that information distilled and relayed to voters in any sort of real way for them to be able to avail themselves of that? If you go to the Westchester website right now, it is slightly improved because we had a number of interventions that included the Attorney General. But at the outset, at the time when people were trying to apply, the governor gave them the ability to apply by phone. It was very hard to find a phone number on the BOE website. It was hard to find an email at one point on the BOE website. So a lot of accountability issues. I do want to just sort of jump to, I should mention the large scale absentee issue that we don't know the answer to right now, as in how great is the scope of the problem, is there's a number of all who requested absentee ballots. And then there's a number of everyone who ultimately voted, either by absentee or in person. Right. And there's a differential there, right? And we might not know that until all the absentees are opened and processed. Some will count, some will be discounted. But what we know is that first number is the number that as of June 16th, people raised their hand, "Hi, I'm ready, willing, and able to vote. I'd like a ballot." And then for whatever reason, the difference between the people who were able to vote and the folks who requested one, did not vote in person, did not cast that mail ballot. That's going to be from what we're hearing anecdotally, that's going to be a sizable number. And that speaks to the process that was hastily put together without ballot tracking in this state in the pandemic. And just to sort of wrap up the point, I do want to mention, in a state of emergency, I come at this from a human rights perspective. Even where the emergency is genuine and bona fide, civil rights are always in danger of being squeezed. And so that's reflected in the poll site consolidation plan that you folks were victimized by on primary day. I believe Reggie testified, the commissioners, on June 1st that they were shooting to consolidate from 336 sites down to about 63. And so, but when was that plan announced? And when were voters given that information? We received some incident reports that people in White Plains had been assigned to one of two sites. I think it's 60,000 population to two sites. There's a disparity there if you look at other localities and how those were split up. But it doesn't even seem like voters were given notice that you might have voted in this location for 30 years, but due to consolidation, your poll site is here. Everyone on this call knows that no matter how eligible you are as a voter, if you vote anywhere other than where you're assigned, we burn your entire ballot in the state. So that is like, you know, a fatal issue there. I could go on, and the only other thing I will say and give you the mic back is that Westchester is required to make sure that every voter can vote early at every site in the county. What we've seen going back to September, October, at this point, I would call it this intentionally ambiguous plan where they put up information that by all intents looks like an assigned plan. They mail voters cards that tell them they're assigned. They put up 4 spreadsheets that you'd have to synthesize to figure out where you're allowed to vote. You'd have to know your town, ward, and ED number to figure out where you're assigned. But then if you call them, or if you're politically connected and you call them, they'll tell you you can vote anywhere. It's very bizarre. We tried to clarify this for months. It's the only county where this happens.
Look, thank you, Jarret. And I'm learning so much from you, so I'm grateful for that. The biggest problem with voter suppression, whether it's intentional in Georgia or unintentional here in Westchester, is once it's done, you can't undo it in real time. We know so many people who saw the lines on primary day. They were enormous and kept driving, right? And those votes are never going to come back. So, Susan Lerner, we have a huge election coming up in November, right? An election of a generation here.
Right.
What is our civic to-do list to try to crack open this black hole of a board of elections and get them to do a better job in November? How do we get some leverage here?
I think there are 2 separate approaches. One is straightforward grassroots and political pressure on the board of legislators and on your county executive. They need to hold hearings. They need to place terms and conditions on the budget money, because remember, the way in which it's set up, even though the Board of Elections is really unaccountable, technically, the county chair nominates the commissioner. The commissioner has to be approved by the Board of Legislatures. I'm not aware of any situation where somebody who actually had a public hearing to be approved was not approved. There's a lot of backroom dealing, I know, in some places where the name is floated to the city council or to the county legislature and they say, don't bring that person to us. We're, you know, do better.
Okay.
But once it gets to the public, it goes through. The budget is passed by the Board of Legislators, and they are somewhat confused. They feel that they have to give a blank check to the board, and we don't believe that that is accurate. At a minimum, they can require better reporting of how the money is being spent by the board.
Okay.
So, and a hearing where the commissioners, not the staff, have to testify about what happened. So that's the first half. The second half is, I would really urge you, if you have any lawyers who would like to do this, to bring a lawsuit under the open meetings law against your Board of Elections. the boards of elections are subject to the open meetings law.
Mm,
But your county board does not hold public meetings, from what I understand. You have an absolute right as a member of the public to observe those meetings. And if they are, look, they're making decisions, but they're making them behind closed doors without any public oversight, and that is a direct violation of the open meetings law. There is absolutely no justification for
okay.
not holding open meetings.
Oh, so the good news is, Susan, the Board of Legislators is having that meeting. I believe it's the third week of July. Maybe somebody else knows. You could put it in the chat. Go ahead, Bruce.
July 20.
July
20th.
20th. Okay, and so we will ask to see an agenda for that meeting prior to it and make sure that the commissioners are being asked to testify directly. And I'm very heartened by all the people taking notes right now. So we have some great
Don't
civic
let
rights.
them send staff in, and staff
Okay.
says things like, well, we were instructed by the commissioners to do X, Y, and Z. And then they're asked a question, well, would the board do the following? And staff says, well, if the commissioners tell us to, right?
Okay.
So it's a
Okay.
dodge not to have the decision makers actually answerable in the public hearings. And you know that's going to be tough. Reggie does
Right.
not come out and talk to the
No,
public.
he does not. No, he does not. And I will
So
say,
you're going to need to have quite a campaign. I think you're going to need to do some publicity on it. I think you're going to need to get editorials and tie in the open meetings law, right?
okay.
Why are the commissioners for your board of elections hiding from the public? They don't hold public meetings and they don't show up for public hearings. Why are they hiding? And put the pressure on politically.
Okay, Jarret Berg, now tell us, what's our dream list of things we want them to do to get ready for November, right? What do we need them to do, and by when, to make sure November goes well?
So I should mention, let's start with absentee balloting. We are in a tough position right now as a state because we do not have a no excuse absentee voting in this state.
Right.
So what was done earlier this year during the state of emergency was to interpret the temporary illness basis to include the risk of contracting or spreading COVID-19, given that everything was shut down and voters were told to stay at home and the illness was spreading in the community. So that rendered voters unavailable due to that apprehension that they could catch the illness that was circulating prevalently in Westchester, in the city, and the rest of the state. So I mention that because if that emergency is extended and then the relief is extended, then everyone would be able to vote by mail if they so chose this fall. And that's an infrastructure challenge too, because the boards, you'd want them preparing for that now. And this was sort of a cagey battle where we were able to expand this, but there was pushback on that. And they didn't expand it beyond June, beyond the present emergency, we'll say. But were that to be extended, we will immediately be in a situation where millions and millions of New Yorkers would be eligible to vote by mail for the first time. We saw more than 10 times the requests for June than we saw in any comparable period. I think even non-comparable periods, higher turnout elections, because so many more voters were eligible. That put an enormous strain on the board and giving them the sympathy that they're due on this, to do that much in such a short amount of time, they were never in a position to be able to get everyone the ballot they were entitled to who requested one in a timely way. There was a national envelope shortage, and I think that if 50 states are in this bind in the fall in various ways, almost 50, we will see those strains. But if that's extended, right now, you go to Westchester BOE's website, it would be pretty difficult to figure out what your rights are, how to apply. The governor allowed people to apply electronically. Several counties put up an online tool right at the top of their website. Literally, click here, take 1 minute to apply for your absentee ballot. We saw that in large counties like Erie and New York City. We saw that in tiny counties like Livingston. We saw that in medium-sized counties like Monroe. So if a county wants to make voter access available, they have tools like that they can use. And that makes things much easier to do a request. It makes it much easier for candidates to tweet out that link and for all of us to inform our neighbors, hey, there's this new option and it's pretty easy to access. Without that, this county compared to the other counties that might have that, your voters need to download a form, maybe print that form, maybe complete it if they know how to complete it on their computer, and add a digital signature that may or may not be required, scan it back, email it in, and then follow up with that request. And there's no tracking, no way to track your absentee request, no way to track your ballot in the mail. So there's some things that we will not be able to get done before November. Some of these, and in the states that have pure vote by mail, they've spent decades building that program and creating that culture among the public. But some of these can be done. We can make sure that ballots are counted, right? We have a rule that we're trying to set down that basically says if a voter is eligible and you can discern their intent, that should be the end of the inquiry unless someone has overwhelming evidence of fraud. Right now, somehow that's sort of flipped, where if someone has any shred of doubt, if your envelope has any tape on it, then they use that to burn your entire ballot, using that little bit of doubt to say, oh, I guess fraudster must have come along, taken that ballot out of your mailbox, changed your vote, sealed it with tape, and you don't even get the opportunity to come in or submit an affidavit or cure that and say, no, that was me. You know, my envelope was messed up and I sealed it with tape, or whatever it might be. Or yes, that's my signature. The one you have on file from 30 years ago has changed slightly. None of that. So we don't have due process safeguards in our law. That's on the absentee front. On early voting, there's good news here for Westchester, because we know that Westchester is perfectly capable of allowing county-wide access. They've told your Board of Legislators that on June 1st. They told your Board of Legislators that late last year in a similar hearing when they were seeking money for new machines. So what we'd like from them is a clear statement that whatever the early voting plan for the fall, any voter may access every site in the county. It should say that at the top. It should say that clearly. It should probably be on the landing page when you get to the website, given the confusion from the past two cycles here. And so on that front, and then if you go to the website, Westchester Board of Elections website, this part drives me nuts. If you were a voter from Yonkers or Greenberg, how many spreadsheets would you need to synthesize to figure out where you voted? The times are in one spreadsheet. The assignments are in another spreadsheet. But if you're from one of those two localities, you'll see that there's two options. It doesn't say you're limited to one of the two. We're told, and I've called them several times to clarify, that were you to show up at the other one, they'll let you vote there and it'll count, but they won't put that in writing anywhere. They certainly didn't include that in your mailer. And to figure out where you're actually supposed to vote, you would need to know your town ward code, which is this bizarre number that nobody knows. It's town ward ED, a 6-digit number that's not written anywhere except maybe on the postcard you got. So this is a county that has done everything they can to make it difficult for people to figure out where to early vote. I know that because we've asked them for months to clarify this, months, going back to August and September of 2019. This was virtually the same plan they put out 96 hours before Election Day. Very few changes between the 2019 plan, the 2020 plan. And the last thing I want to mention, Allison, we gave them a map. We said, here's a map. Please, you can embed this on your website, create your own map. I'm not a tech guy. I'm a voting rights lawyer. It took me 15 minutes to make that map. And they still couldn't be bothered to put up a simple site plan, a simple way for people to find their sites. So
the website, Jarret, is somebody who has been in civic tech for 15 years. The website is painful to look at. I have dozens and dozens of open source coders who would love to get in there and fix that, but you have to have a Board of Elections that actually wants to do this. And I know that we have several county legislators on this call right now, which I'm really heartened about. I see Nancy is here and Mary Jane is here, and thank you all for really digging into this. But, you know, at the end of the day, as Susan and Jarret, like you're saying, you have to have a Board of Elections wanting to engage with the public. Suzanne Kernan, I know that we are getting a ton of questions here on the chat. Can you start us off with one of those questions from the chat box?
There are a zillion great questions.
And we'll, you know what, and just to say, Suzanne, we'll capture these and make sure we have answers and we share them publicly with folks if we don't get to them live in this call.
Okay. So one of the recent ones is, Mary Jane Shimsky is asking Jarret, some legislators aggressively promoted early voting in their districts. Do we know how the early voting turnout differed from district to district, or was it fairly even?
So that's a great question. Two answers, like every other good question you ask a lawyer about election law. So the boards were only required to report the end of day top line total to the state. And so that's what I have access to. But these e-poll books have incredible data potential, and there's very little law on this. And these e-poll books are brand new. In fact, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, I don't think the Westchester BOE understands the data potential of those e-poll books. All of this is publicly available info, but what I'm saying is the e-poll books, specific books, can tell you when a voter checked in, when they were powered up, how much battery they have left before they need a charge. Those totals are all available in White Plain. They belong to you folks, not your Board of Elections. That is a public resource. And so the short answer is 17 early voting sites. You can absolutely see by the day who voted early at which sites. And frankly, these boards are required to do a proactive process of, let's say there was long lines at one site and another site was underutilized, to reallocate the resources within 24 hours to correct those things. So the data exists. I am not privy to it. And given the transparency issues we've had with your board, I think it would take a while for me to get that breakdown, but it certainly exists and is available. And that stuff should be made available to candidates and the van, right? In real time. I mean, that's how you'd be doing GOTV in a modern world.
Here's a real difference to me between a professional election administration and the politically driven administration we have here. There are counties across the country who use ballot on demand, e-poll books, and the scanners, and they are able to tell you how long the lines are. They are able to give their voters real-time reports. Don't go to early voting location A because there's a 15-minute wait, but there's no wait at early voting locations D, E, and F. They can tell you how much time the voters are taking between the time that they print out the ballot and they scan them in. All of that information exists in the machines, but you have to know to get it out, and you have to be interested in improving the election administration to use the data.
And I want to add on that because just from a data perspective, this is a new world ripe with voter protection data. We can see technically how many voters were challenged, where and when. You could do a racial demographic overlay on top of that after an election to see what kind of administration we're getting. And if a voter was not found in the poll book and then diverted to vote provisionally by affidavit ballot, that data should be available too. It should all be available in a very clean reconciliation report. And the fact that that's now digital makes it easier to package and parse. But the law has not caught up with the technology yet, which scares me. It's kind of the Wild West. In other words, Allison, you were in a primary. If you are in a primary, if you had requested the list of everyone who early voted, in your district on Monday for that first weekend, so that you could sort of cross them off the list. I mean, that's the sort of thing that could be exported and emailed in a spreadsheet.
Well, I will say this: we were getting that information daily from Kristen Stavitsky in Rockland.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And they were very responsive to us.
So it is possible and it exists in a very friendly format, but without law to sort of clarify those edges. And now think about this in a November context. If the tech person is of one party or the other, so who is getting that cut and who isn't? And what are the rules about that?
That was a problem actually with some of the candidates for the primaries that in the congressional district that spanned the Bronx and Westchester. The board was playing favorites in New York City and the Bronx as to who they would provide absentee balloting information to and who they gave the runaround.
Well, I will say, Susan, from a political perspective, it may not have been the smartest thing to call for the forced resignation of the entire Board of Elections 2 weeks before the election, which may have been a part of the reason why we got no information at all about who had voted. I'm just saying, maybe not the smartest thing to do, but I would do it again.
And I will just say,
Nonetheless, it doesn't matter because they are obligated to provide the information to everybody. The whole point of this political system is supposedly, and the only way, here's another great quote to take away. The only way, according to the stalwarts, to have an honest election is if a Democrat and a Republican go toe-to-toe to keep each other from cheating. Now, it's just never occurred to any of them that what we have now is a system where the Democrat and the Republican link arms against the voter.
Right.
And that's got to change. And that's why it's so exciting to have these discussions. They have gotten away with this for decades because voters were not paying attention. Americans traditionally have just figured we've got the best democracy, the best election system. I show up, I vote, everything's great. I don't have to pay much money for it. I don't have to worry about it. Somebody else is taking care of it. And what we have seen since 2016 is that if we are not taking care of it, we can't trust the people who supposedly are.
Okay, so getting back to our next steps, Jarret, right? So we know the Board of Legislators is going to have their open meeting on July 20th, and hopefully we'll ask for the commissioners to be testifying there. We know we have to have the state certify that this can be basically a no-fault vote by absentee ballot election in November, right? And we've got to have the Board of Elections here communicate a gazillion times better, for instance, that you can vote early at any polling place. I didn't know that until this election, right? Why even send out a polling place for me to go to, although mine said Mount Vernon, which isn't even in the congressional district, when there was no need. You could have just sent out, here are early voting polling places that anybody can go to early and vote, right? In addition, we know that on election day, people were being told they couldn't vote or had to vote with a provisional ballot if they had an absentee ballot at home, which is not true, which is not legal as well. So the poll workers were unclear what the rules were as well. And we're going to need more
poll workers were not trained.
Poll workers were not trained.
Primary. That's the problem. They were not trained before the primary.
Here.
Anywhere.
Why, Susan? Why would poll workers not be trained?
Lack of money and an inability of the boards of elections to figure out how to train people remotely.
They couldn't do a call like this?
I listen, preaching to the choir here.
I know.
It's just not that difficult to transition to Zoom since few boards have hands-on training. They mostly talk at people and show them examples. They don't let them work with the machinery. So that is something which absolutely we have been talking for a very long time. Training is inadequate. And that does become a budget question. So basically the boards train once a year.
So, and
that, when that happens, depends on how much information. Part of the problem, if you train before the primary, I've seen poll workers get confused in the general election and tell voters they can only vote for candidates in their political party in November. So we need to have the resources to train people and to recruit more effectively. And that's a whole other discussion of how to get better poll workers.
Suzanne Kernan, do you see another question from the group?
Oh yes. So there is a mention here of election security forum. Lulu Freestadt mentions and shares the link, which we can then share with everyone on this group afterwards. She says it's coming up on July 6th, where we will be discussing legislative solutions to these issues, like prohibiting party leaders from becoming election commissioners and having audits with neutral oversight. And so she's inviting folks to register and attend, and please, share broadly. That sounds like a good thing. Nicola Coddington says that even when the commissioners themselves have attended Board of Legislature Budget and Appropriations Committee meetings, and I observed them to make statements that I knew to be untrue, and they also made threatening innuendos towards legislators that were opposing them. So, and then someone else mentioned that those meetings don't usually have a provision for public comment, which is another challenge that should be on our radar.
Right.
Can I speak to that very quickly?
Sure.
I just want to hit a few issues that you mentioned, Suzanne. So the first two security issues that were raised, one in 2019, one in 2020, that are pretty serious because it goes to, those of us who fought for early voting, there was always the specter of that this could raise integrity issues around our elections. So it's important that the security side be well thought through from a protocol perspective, but then actually be followed. In 2019, we were told that on election day itself, Westchester had switched back, I believe, to paper books, and so their system for telling for knowing on election day who had voted early was that they were going to supply the poll site with a paper list of those, just in the aggregate, a raw list of everyone eligible to vote in that district who had voted early. We got multiple reports that those lists weren't supplied for the 6 a.m. opening. So then for some period of time at a few sites, they didn't have a list of who had voted early. In other words, you can only vote once. The e-poll books prevent that. But when they're not used on election day, there has to be some kind of reconciliation. This year, we got at least one report that the e-poll books were running on public Wi-Fi, which of course is not allowed. There's a whole security checklist that prohibits that and talks about firewalls and how to set up your system so it's secure. So that's the sort of thing that really needs to be chased down just from a sort of cyber hygiene perspective to give people faith in the election itself. One thing that you had mentioned, Allison, was this business about poll worker training. But when it goes down in an unfriendly voter way, it really does vitiate the voters' civil rights. So absentee balloting, it could not be more different. What we saw in New York City in that final weekend of early voting, the city board conceding that there would be voters who didn't receive their ballot in time, said if you haven't received your ballot at this point, go vote early and disregard your request, which is of course what the law says. That if you requested an absentee ballot because maybe you thought you'd be outside the jurisdiction, turns out you were there, you are supposed to vote in person. Whether you received your ballot, whether it never showed up, it doesn't matter. You vote in person. And remember that point about why we don't know who won certain races yet? Because they're still receiving those ballots up until, I believe, today. So that's the safeguard there, is there is no way to double vote. There was no need for this instruction to be, oh, you stand right here. We're going to call White Plains and see if you're eligible. And then that a voter who shows up whose name is in the book when they're in that situation, they should be voting a regular ballot. We also received reports from folks in government saying that they were told by the people who train poll workers that they were told not to distribute affidavit ballots, which all I can say is it completely undermines the entire system.
Everybody, in violation of federal laws.
Everybody.
Thank you. Not the least of that. I want to ask.
I just saw the smoke go out of Susan's ears. Everybody has a right to an affidavit ballot. It's a safeguard. It's a fail-safe. If you think you're a Democrat, but somehow the list doesn't have you as a Democrat, the only way you preserve your rights is by doing an affidavit, and then they sort that out later. But if you're
Right.
not given one, if you're not offered one, if you're told you're not a Democrat, leave, then you haven't exercised your rights, you haven't preserved your rights. Now there's nothing you can do. That's a massive problem.
I want to ask, Gail Sasso has an announcement for a meeting tomorrow, so I want to give her a chance to tell us about that. I'm trying to unmute you, Gail.
And while you do that, just Brian Higby
can you
commented
unmute
that there's a
yourself?
website for military to request a ballot and track their ballot. So why not make that available to every New York voter?
Actually, the state looked at that after the governor issued his executive order expanding the availability of absentees, and they came to the conclusion that they could not scale it up for the numbers that they were expecting. And since the boards received 1.7 million requests for absentee ballots, I don't know, whether their inability to scale to what should have been a 2 million volume level was accurate or not. But I do know that they looked at that and they wanted to do it, but they came back and said that it was not scalable.
Thank you.
Gail, you want to tell us about your meeting?
Sure, yes. So thank you, Allison, for this. It's been a nice addition to all of the work we've been doing. Tomorrow night, CoHope has scheduled a meeting with George Latimer and Ken Jenkins. It's a Zoom call. And the objective of that meeting is to begin to talk with them more directly about how the Board of Legislators begins to work through the system with us. We've been very much aware of the information that you've offered tonight. Susan, you remember coming to our group, I think almost 3 years ago?
Yes, I do.
And at that time, our Raising the Board of Elections and are all looking very despairing because it was a very deep hole. But now we are here, and it's been kind of like a perfect storm. Things are coming together in a terrific way. So tomorrow night, it will be a Zoom call. Many of you know who are on our membership list. But those of you who don't and would like the link, best way might be to, I don't know, what's the best way to get it out? Either email me at cohopeindivisible@gmail.com, or maybe just make a note in the chat that you might be interested in the link, and we will get that to you. It's tomorrow at 6:30. Thank you.
I send out, in addition, thank you, Gail, and thank you for your graciousness. I really want to be very clear with folks. There are a lot of people working on this issue, and Indivisibles are working on it. Gail's group has been working on it. The Board of Legislators are working on it. And so there's great interest, and there are many folks working very hard on this. I send out a
Which gives
regular.
us the best opportunity to affect the changes. Changes this challenging do not come easily, but the organizing that you are doing is invaluable. And ultimately, I believe we will reform the system.
Well, this is our opportunity, Susan, as you well know, right? In times of great disruption and great chaos, there's always opportunity. And this is ours now to depoliticize this Elections Bureau and to open that up to the public. This is ours. We should have access and full ownership of this thing. I send out a morning email and I will be putting a write-up of this in that. If anybody wants to get on that list, you can just let me know. I am aware of the time. Is there, Suzanne, did you see any pressing question in the chat?
There's a couple, there's two at least. One is, and somebody has Lulu just put this tomorrow night Zoom link is in the chat, everybody. So we'll take that and we will share it out. Naomi Mero has a question. Should we expect Cuomo to support purposeful change at the BOE?
Francis Snedeker enjoyed that question very much. I like your reaction, Francis. That was great. Susan Lerner, this is your bailiwick. What do you think we can expect of the governor?
We need a constitutional change to get the political control of the Board of Elections accomplished. That doesn't require the cooperation of the governor. That requires the cooperation of the legislature and the voters.
Okay, so
Okay.
we have a number of things we need a constitutional change to. One is just regular vote by mail. Another would be ranked choice voting, right? And another would be depoliticizing these boards of elections, right?
I'm not sure, I'm not willing to say that we need a constitutional amendment for ranked choice voting, but
Okay,
we do definitely need one and we've taken the first step for no fault absentee and for same day registration. And we definitely need a constitutional amendment to get nonpartisan professional election administration for our state.
okay. I was on the democracy team at Demos that worked on the early voting, the same day voting registration. Is there
Allison?
a last
Sorry.
question, Suzanne?
There's from Rhea Malich. She learned today that Justin Sweet, that's one of the candidates in the Senate District 38 primary to replace David Carlucci, succeed him, today filed court papers asking that he be declared the nominee and trying to prevent the counting of all absentee ballots. And so Rhea's asking, how is this going to vote for November? And because apparently he's trying to disenfranchise over 15,000 votes. How, Jarret, Susan, comment here?
Well,
To
I'll
my-
comment to say that every ballot that was cast is going to be reviewed. So whether they're discounted or counted is a process that will work out. But I haven't seen that paper, but I don't think that goes anywhere. Where it bodes for November is in close contest, we will have this sort of situation play out the way it is now, but it's bound to be just as ugly or uglier because election litigation is used as a tool, both to gunk up the process and also to try to exert in the region, in the Hudson Valley, sometimes do like an impound order, and then from there, they won't serve it on certain counties. So they'll choose the county where they believe they'll do the best, run up the score there, lay the process somewhere else. These are games that can be played. I am very much concerned about our primitive due process on the back end.
Your audio has gone, what was the word, Susan? Bourgeois. Your audio has gone bourgeois.
There's feedback, somebody's getting feedback.
Yeah.
So
So
if you go mute, then
Susan Moulter.
you know what? So we are past 8. I am aware of everybody's time here. And this is clearly the first of what will be ongoing conversations with the Board of Legislators, with indivisible groups like Gales and others. And I'd say let's take advantage of this opportunity and let's make some real, deep, lasting change together. So thank you all for your time tonight. I'm grateful. And this has all been recorded and it's on Facebook Live too. So anybody who wants to see it or share it, that will certainly be possible. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you,
Bye.
Allison.
Bye.